Meanwhile, the United Nations is convening an international aid conference in Geneva later today aimed at raising over $600 million for Afghanistan. The UN is warning of a humanitarian crisis following the Taliban takeover. Billions of dollars in foreign donations were cut off following the collapse of the country's Western-backed government. Even before the takeover last month, half the population in Afghanistan depended on aid. The UN hopes to raise funds through the conference to ease pressure on its programs. It says the number of people in need of aid is expected to increase due to drought and shortages of cash and food. Let's get you the latest from Tony Waterman, who's live for us in Brussels. Tony, thank you very much for joining us. So what are the expectations from that meeting and why is it necessary?
Well, ultimately, what the United Nations is looking for is money, as you mentioned, hoping to raise some $600 million at this aid convention that's going to be taking place in Geneva later this afternoon. This is money that would be used to stave off a humanitarian crisis. We have heard these very dire warnings from the likes of the UN, from WHO as well. There are 18 million people who are dependent on aid even before the Taliban took over last month. And the concern is that that number is going to grow exponentially in the weeks and months to come. There are a lot of factors at play here. You mentioned the drought, the cash shortage that's at hand, but also we're talking about 20 years of a prolonged conflict that has made it difficult for people to get food supplies and to maintain healthy lives. And also we are in the middle of a pandemic, so that is also at play here, but it is really this short-term immediacy of the drying up of humanitarian aid that is having the most impact. Billions and billions of dollars from Western countries, the United States, the EU, has been put on hold because these countries are very concerned that this money, this food, these medical supplies and equipment are going to fall into the hands of the Taliban government instead of going to the people that need it most. So they have put these programs on hold at the moment, and there won't even be talk of resuming these aid programs until there are reassurances and proof from the Taliban that they are going to, first and foremost, respect human rights, particularly for women, and also ensure that Afghanistan does not become a safe haven for terrorist activities and criminal gangs. Of course, we have seen some exceptions to this. China and Pakistan, for example, they have both already sent plane loads worth of humanitarian aid into Afghanistan. Both those countries share a border with Afghanistan, so concerns that a humanitarian crisis could spark a refugee crisis, and neither of them would like to see refugees flooding into their respective countries. Russia also said today that it plans to start supplying humanitarian aid, but when you have this type of crisis potentially at hand, this type of humanitarian crisis is going to take really a global response. And this is what this conference this afternoon is hoping to achieve.
Okay, so where is aid needed most, Tony?
Well, food and water are the two things that are needed most desperately at this point. And about 1/3 of that $600 million that the UN is hoping to raise is going to be earmarked for the World Food Program to supply food and clean water. It's also medical supplies and equipment. The WHO, the World Health Organization, warned last week that up to 90% of Afghanistan's 2,300 medical facilities could be forced to close because the Western donors that keep them open have been barred from sending over funding. So this is very crucial, again, when you have a continuing crisis, conflict ongoing, and the pandemic. So they want to keep those corridors open. Of course, the Central Bank of Afghanistan does have quite a large sum of assets, $10 billion, but this is kept largely overseas, and those assets have been frozen right now. The Taliban cannot get their hands on that money. So it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort to get the economy back up and running. And we are starting to see very, very faint signs that this is happening. You had Pakistan International Airlines, its first commercial flight landed in Kabul earlier this morning. This was a chartered flight by the World Bank that brought over officials and also journalists. So we are seeing the faint resumption of the economy. But again, this is a country in crisis at the moment, and it's going to take a lot more than that to bring it back into some semblance of stability.